a sewer jack has gone missing, and the crew that were with him tell a strange tale of a newly collapsed set of chambers. Strange screams of death and weird happenings surround the place. Grab a lantern and hold your nose as we venture through the sewers to uncover the curse of the Maggot God. Hi everyone, I'm Gary, and we're once again back talking about another Old School Essentials adventure. And we are going to talk about Curse of the Maggot God. Now, this is the second adventure in this adventure anthology, and the author of each of the adventures in it are by a different author. This is by Glyn Seal, and the art is by Peter Pagano. It's for second to third level adventurers. Really, it's just a low level adventure that's not really for first level adventurers. It's not for ultra fragile characters. It's part of this anthology. It's the second one in the anthology. Now, I've already reviewed the first one in the anthology. You can see my review of The Jeweler Sanctum, which is the first adventure, if you click up in the top right now. But each of the adventures in this anthology is worth mentioning, and they're not part of one campaign. They are modular in the traditional sense, and they're supposed to be slotted into anyone's campaign. So, before we get going on the Curse of the Maggot God, let's just have my bona fides. I've run it once, and I've run it once for my own system, Journeyman Expert Master, which is an old school adjacent rule system. And that was for a party of 4 characters, a very well-balanced party, but they were 6th level, so I had to make some adjustments to the challenge of particular encounters. Now, the way Journeyman Expert Master works, you don't actually have to change kind of much for making a low-level encounter work with high-level characters. I also ran it as part of my ongoing campaign of the Night Below, or Night Below, which I reviewed the first part of that as well. You can see my review of the first part of Night Below up here, and that's slotted into that particular campaign really, really well. Now, let's just go through the through line. What is this module actually about? Well, you've got a generic cultist, Malarian the Unwashed. He's a priest of the Maggot God. It never explains who the Maggot God is. That's left for you to fill in those details, and I appreciate the modularity of that. And he is Malarian the Unwashed has been banished from outside the city. While Malarian was in exile from the city, whatever city that is, he came across this kind of corpulent maggot-like monster in a cave, which he believed to be the embodiment of his god. Malarian then befriended a tribe of troglodytes and converted them to worshipping the maggot god along with him. So they're kind of his underlings. They're his kind of like grunts, his orc type characters. Now, Malarian and the troglodytes, they currently feed the thing that they believe to be their god, the maggot god. And they've got it in a kind of set of caves whose chambers connect to the ruins of an ancient villa, but also the city's sewers. And recently, this is where the players come in, a group of sewer patrolmen have come across a collapsed passage in the sewers that lead to the villa's chambers. And one of their sewermen, the newest member of their group, a guy called Hal, has decided to venture in, and then his screams are kind of heard, and he was like dragged off. We know as the game master that he was dragged up by the troglodytes and fed to the Maggot God. The other sewermen fled, and now the guild of sewermen have issued a bounty for the party to go in and investigate this new area connected to the sewers. That's where the players come in. They take up the job and go in. Now, what did I like about this module? There's actually quite a lot to talk about. Of the 4 adventures in here, I read all of them before running any of them. I've decided that I want to say I've decided to run them in order. I haven't actually. I've run the first one, the second one. I've run the 4th one. I've still got the 3rd one to run. But this was the module that I instantly fell in love with. This was the one that I really wanted to have a look at and play, just based on its tone. The tone is disgusting. It's so vile in places. It's so kind of bodily. One of the first things that kind of hit me was, as a game master of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, how well this would work as a Wufret module. These could quite easily be Nurgle cultists. You could swap those troglodytes out for any type of kind of Nurglisk monster, and it would work just as well. I actually think tonally, it doesn't really read like a normal old school module, which are often kind of mimicking the gonzo feeling of the late 70s, early 80s, or they're kind of folkloric. This isn't that at all. It's grimy and grungy. And for that reason, it was the first module in this book that I was actually drawn to. Part of this kind of grimy, grungy brilliance is the quality of some of the descriptions in here, and it's actually the minor descriptions, and they're absolutely vile. And there's when they get to the Maggot God, the characters, and they destroy it, which is this giant, corpulent, wheezing like maggot creature, it explodes. And I'm just going to read you the description of its Death Deluge ability. Death Deluge. When the Maggot God reaches 0 hit points, its body ruptures, spewing forth its thick, creamy innards in a torrent. All creatures within 20 feet must save versus death or fall over and get washed hard against the wall for 1d6 damage. I love that. The thick, creamy innards. It's just like it makes me feel really sick. And it's absolutely wonderful. And there's quite a lot of that throughout this. Another thing is that each of the troglodytes are host to these kind of disgusting giant maggots that when they die, they like vomit them forth and they can kind of wriggle out of their mouths. It's really disgusting, but I love it. Another thing I really like this module is that it's a module. It's so modular, and you can place it anywhere in your campaign world quite easily, especially beneath a large city. I find in my experience that modular adventures of an urban variety are quite rare, and the reason for that is that there is quite often too much in a module that situates it in a particular city. There's a fantastic module for DCC called The Jeweler Who Dealt in Stardust that I think also does this really well, where it's even though it's supposed to be set in a particular city, it can actually be set anywhere. And that's something that The Curse of the Maggot God does really well. So if you're looking for a good urban adventure, there's also a really good dungeon crawl. Those two things don't often go together either. I would recommend this. The other thing that I really like is that there's 3 different areas of the dungeon. There's the sewer tunnels, then there is the collapsed villa, and the caves where the Maggot God resides. And each of these places feels distinct and different. While they're in the sewers, you've got the disgusting kind of like wading through the kind of like the effluent and the filth. When they get out of there and they get into the villa, which is probably the order they're going to do it in, it's kind of cracked mosaics and ancient kind of baths and things like that. And then eventually they get to the caves, you got the stalactites and this wheezing kind of like disgusting mass of the Maggot God at the bottom. I really enjoy that. There's some really cool loops in the dungeon, in the design of the dungeon, which makes the layout more fun to explore. I mentioned the idea of using loops in order to kind of linearize a dungeon before in my how to design a dungeon video. If you click up in the top right, you can see that. It's a really classic feel at times. I feel like while it's a strong tone of kind of like disgust, sometimes it's a kind of good, I know it sounds bad, a good kind of classic generic dungeon. And that's accentuated by the art. That reminds me of early D&D art. And again, the art's by a guy called Peter Pagano. It's just wonderful. All of the stuff that I've run so far in here has great art. And I've just basically always shown it to my players as they come across it. There's also another thing that I've talked about before in that same dungeon design video that I really like is factional play. Different factions at play in the dungeon. And there's a little bit of factional play here that if the game master decides that that's what they really want, they will actually get quite a bit of mileage out of it. In the sense that there is Malarian, who is the kind of the human high priest of the Maggot God. And then there's Muklatuk, who is the leader of the troglodytes, who basically wants the priest's place. And if the game master has a mastery of that, then what they'll be able to do is set that conflict up for the players to interact with. That was a flaw in my own running of this, that I wasn't sensitive enough to that the first time I ran this, which is the only time I've run this. If I ran it again, I would make a bigger deal of that. The writing, as ever, because obviously it's for Old School Essentials, I assume everything for Old School Essentials is signed off by Gavin Norman, who is the who created Old School Essentials. He's listed as one of the developers and editors on the book. The writing is clear and the formatting is clear. This is something that you don't actually really need to read every detail of it before you run it. That's quite hard to achieve. You can see it. I've talked about Gavin Norman's ability to do this before in my video on his own module that he wrote from the ground up, Winter's Daughter. But yeah, have a look. And it's something that I really appreciate as a game master who doesn't have loads of time to prep every week. I just want to be able to pick something up and know that as long as I've kind of read the introduction and I have a kind of general sense of what's going on, I'm going to be able to run something that's really fun. Now, what did I change? And what concerns should a game master have? There's one big change that I made, but it's not going to be relevant to most people, so I'm going to save that to the end. There's a couple of things, though, that we need to talk about that are concerning about this module. I only review things that I think are good, and I think so far, the 3 that I've run, this is the weakest one. And it's because of a couple of things that you can change immediately to make it to make it as good as I think the author intended it to be, because it is a really good module. There's just a couple of things that are really glaring. So first of all, the game master's background is a little bit confusing to me. It talks of how Malarian was banished from the city to a kind of fetid swamp where he found a cave with a maggot god in it. That's area 19 on the map. But it's clear that that's below the city. That didn't kind of really make much sense to me. The idea that he's outside the city, but he's so close to the city that these caves kind of connect to it. It doesn't talk about, at least as far as I can see in the module, so apologies if it does. It doesn't talk about him transporting the maggot god kind of thing to these caves beneath the city. It says that this is, I think it says that this is the one where it was. So I just kind of ignored that and assumed that Malarian had found this maggot god thing and then brought it to these kind of caves beneath the sewers in the city. Um, I think that makes more sense to me. That's one thing. A couple of other things. One of the rooms has a magic mouth that only works if the party approach through the ruins of the villa. So most parties, and they're going to do this because it's the setup where they meet the sewer jacks, they meet the kind of like the sewer men. They're going to approach through the sewers to the villa rooms. But there's one room that has a magic mouth that is only triggered if they enter through the ruins of the villa that must be above somewhere in the city. Maybe several buildings have been built on top of this ancient villa, but however, what it is, they've got to come down this filled and ruined staircase with this magic mouth to activate. I'm going to be perfectly honest. I think the chances of that happening are zero. I think most parties are not going to approach that way. Most game masters are, the way the module is written, not encouraged to. They're not explicitly told that this is really a possibility for the party until they read that room in a bit of detail. They don't really get a sense that the party could approach through this villa. So while there are technically multiple entrances to this dungeon, there's de facto only one entrance, which is the way that the sewer people take them. So I would broadcast and communicate the clear possibility of entering this dungeon from multiple angles if I were to run this again. I'd make a point of saying that maybe there's someone excavating this kind of a villa on the surface, or the sewer jacks know that you can enter via the sewer, or these other possible ways through people's basements, for example. That'd be a wonderful way of doing it. But I just broadcast that because I'm a big believer in having multiple entrances to dungeons. It gives the players more agency. Another thing is that there's a few too many rooms with just kind of troglodytes hanging about. Now, they are interesting troglodytes, and wild troglodytes, fighting is fun, and they spew those ugly maggot monsters on their death, which I think that sometimes the module maybe nails that classic feel of going room to room and slaughtering monsters a little bit too much. There's a couple of rooms where it's just troglodytes with which is just attack the players as soon as they go in, or they're kind of like sleeping. But there's not really as much interactability as some of the other modules that I've run for Old School Essentials, or in the OSR generally. So I'd maybe change that up a little bit. But the really big thing, there's one cardinal sin that this module commits, which I wouldn't have thought of as a cardinal sin until I ran this, and I was like, oh wow, this really hamstrung my experience, or the experience of my players. When Hal and the sewer jack who went missing, when he entered the villa, he was grabbed by the troglodytes and dragged off to the cave system by the troglodytes. He left a blood trail that led his way through the dungeon. Now, there's an implied timer here. The sewer jacks don't know that their friend has already been sacrificed. There's a sense that maybe we can rescue him if we hurry up. The problem is that if you communicate this implied timer to your players, and they see this blood trail, they are going to follow it. And that's exactly what my party did. They followed it perfectly through this optimal line. And that's what I'm going to say is the cardinal sin. It provides an optimal route through a dungeon where there's all these cool, interesting rooms and there's circularity and there's lots of different areas. My players just followed that blood trail because they were like, we need to get this guy, hopefully before something really terrible happens to him. And they didn't see about a third of the module because of this. So I would get rid of that blood trail completely, or maybe have it dragged from one room to the next, and that's it, just two rooms, and then just have it kind of like, be muddied by troglodyte boot prints or whatever, right? Because you want your players to see everything. I've just said that I want people to pick up a module and just start running it. For the most part, I don't mind doing the reading. I'm not averse to reading at all, but I just don't have that much time to read every single line 4 or 5 times, then pass everything out like some game masters do. I just need to start running it. So my advice to you is, if you run this, and it is a good module, I feel like I've talked quite negatively about it, but actually, I really do want you to understand that you could buy this anthology just for this adventure and you'd be satisfied, but you've got to get rid of that blood trail, because the players are just going to follow it. If they're good players, right? If they're players that are well versed in OSR play, in old school play, where they are goal orientated and their goal is to rescue this guy, they're going to follow that blood trail. They're not going to risk unnecessary combats in other rooms. So, oh, and the last thing that I mentioned earlier that I'd say at the end that I'd change that's significant, but not it's not relevant really to everyone else is that I ran this as part of um my Night Below campaign. And I had in that campaign, wizards are being snatched. And in my campaign, obviously, when you run a campaign, any adventure, it changes as soon as it's in your world. Obviously, in that campaign, mind flayers are snatching magic users and they're taking them to the Underdark. In my version of this, when I ran Curse of the Maggot God, it wasn't Malarian, or it was Malarian, but Malarian was a mind flayer, and Hal wasn't a sewer jack. He was a wizard who'd been snatched off the streets and kind of taken below, and they had to stop him. Now, helpfully, one thing that change that I'd already made in that campaign is that I had the mind flayers and their overlords, the Aboleth, be worshipping a kind of worm god anyway. So it meant that the maggot god just fit. I just kind of changed from a maggot to a worm. But that's one minor change that I made. It was really good fun. It fit really nicely. The players didn't seem to notice that I wasn't running part of Night Below. I was running a different module. But it was really good fun. Now that's Curse of the Maggot God. Below you can find a link to it. You can also find links to a free copy of my rule set, Journeyman Expert Master. As I said, I ran this adventure with Gem. There's some pre-generated characters for Gem and some kind of free modules for it as well. So finally, as ever, whether you've just found this useful or interesting, or you've just enjoyed sitting and kind of listening to me ramble for a few minutes, but please like and subscribe, do all that good stuff. I'm Gary, and I will speak with you again soon. Thank you.